April 1945. Western Germany. The road is clogged with men who no longer march. Steel helmets hang loose in their hands. Rifles are slung without purpose. Some carry white cloth tied to bayonets. Others raise empty palms into the air. The sound of war has thinned here. No artillery barrage. No shouted commands. Only boots scraping gravel and the low rumble of American trucks moving east. These are not defeated men in flight. They are choosing something. German soldiers, young and old, step out from forests, farmhouses, and shattered villages. They approach American lines slowly, cautiously. Many have been fighting for years. Poland, France, Russia, Italy, Normandy, the Ardennes. Now they stop. An American corporal waves them forward. No blows, no insults. No gunfire. By the end of this month, nearly 480,000 German soldiers will lay down their weapons in the West rather than continue the fight or risk capture elsewhere. Entire formations will dissolve without a final battle. Commanders will surrender forces larger than pre-war European armies. It is one of the largest mass capitulations in military history, and it raises a question that haunted both sides in 1945. Why did so many German soldiers surrender to the Americans instead of fighting on? The answer begins long before these roads fell silent. By the winter of 1944, the war Germany had started no longer resembled the war it could win. On the Western Front, the balance of power had shifted decisively. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, had not merely opened a second front. They had shattered the strategic logic that had sustained the Third Reich since 1939 for the first time. Germany faced a fully mobilized industrial coalition, advancing directly toward its core territories. After the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, American forces pushed east with a speed that stunned German planners. Operation Cobra collapsed German defenses in northern France. Paris was liberated in August. By September, Allied spearheads reached the German border itself. The Western Front, once stabilized behind the Atlantic Wall, had become fluid, unpredictable, and fatally exposed. Germany attempted to regain initiative through one final gamble. In December 1944, Hitler ordered a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes. The goal was strategic reversal: split the American and British armies, capture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. For weeks, the fighting was brutal. Whether grounded Allied aircraft, American units were encircled. German armor advanced farther than expected, but the gamble failed by January 1945. The Battle of the Bulge had bled Germany dry. Elite panzer divisions lost irreplaceable tanks and crews. Fuel reserves already critically low were burned away in futile thrusts. Luftwaffe pilots, rushed and undertrained, were shot down faster than they could be replaced. When the weather cleared, Allied air power returned with overwhelming force. From that moment forward, the Western Front became a war of attrition Germany could not sustain. The numbers alone told the story. By early 1945, the United States Army fielded over 3 million men in the European theater. American factories were producing tanks, trucks, ammunition, and aircraft in quantities Germany could no longer match. Allied logistics flowed uninterrupted from ports in France and Belgium, across newly repaired rail lines, and straight to the front. Germany, by contrast, was hollowing out from the inside. Years of bombing had crippled transportation networks, fuel shortages, immobilized armored units. Infantry divisions existed largely on paper, rebuilt again and again with teenagers, convalescents, and older reservists. Weapons were scarce. Training was rushed. Command cohesion eroded as units were shuffled to plug collapsing fronts at the same time. Germany was fighting for survival in the East. The Red Army's summer offensives in 1944, particularly Operation Bagration, had annihilated Army Group Center. Entire German armies ceased to exist. Hundreds of thousands were killed or captured. By January 1945, Soviet forces stood on the Oder River, less than 70 kilometers from Berlin. Germany was being crushed from both sides, yet Hitler refused any strategic retreat. His orders grew more detached from battlefield reality. Units were instructed to hold ground to the last man. Unauthorized withdrawals were treated as treason. Officers who attempted to preserve their forces risked court-martial or worse. This created a fatal contradiction. German soldiers were ordered to fight for territory that no longer held military value, with weapons and supplies that no longer existed. Against an enemy whose material superiority was absolute, the Wehrmacht was expected to function as if the conditions of 1940 still applied. They did not. In the West, American forces advanced methodically. Towns were bypassed, encircled, reduced by artillery and airstrikes. German units found themselves cut off with increasing frequency. Radios went silent. Ammunition ran out. Food supplies dwindled. Relief never came. The front was no longer a line. It was a series of shrinking pockets as February 1945 began. The question facing many German soldiers was no longer whether Germany would lose the war. That outcome was already clear. The question was how and to whom they would surrender. That distinction mattered more than Berlin understood. For German soldiers in 1945, surrender was not a single decision. It was a calculation. For years, Nazi propaganda had drawn sharp distinctions between Germany's enemies. The Western Allies were portrayed as decadent, materialistic, weakened by democracy. The Soviet Union, by contrast, was depicted as an existential, threat-racial, ideological, and merciless. These narratives were exaggerated, distorted, and often outright false. But by the final months of the war, experience had given them terrifying weight. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers had witnessed a war without restraint. Villages burned, civilians fled in frozen columns, prisoners disappeared. The brutality was mutual, amplified by years of ideological warfare and reprisal. As the Red Army advanced westward in 1944 and 1945, stories of violence some inflated by rumor spread rapidly through German ranks. Whether accurate or not, these accounts shaped behavior. The Western Front felt different, American and British. Forces had a reputation earned and reinforced for a systematic handling of prisoners. Captured soldiers were searched, disarmed, registered, and transported. Food was issued. Medical care, while basic, was provided. Officers were separated. Orders were followed. The Geneva Convention mattered in the West. German soldiers knew this. Many had already been prisoners earlier in the war, captured in North Africa or Italy, and later repatriated due to wounds or exchanges. Others had heard directly from comrades who returned from Allied captivity. Letters circulated quietly. So did comparisons as Allied forces crossed into Germany itself. This contrast became impossible to ignore. By March 1945, American units reached the Rhine River long, considered a natural defensive barrier. German planners hoped to destroy the bridges and force a prolonged stand on the eastern bank. But on March 7, 1945, elements of the U.S. 9th Armored Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact. It was a psychological shock. Within days, American infantry and armor poured across the Rhine. Additional crossings followed at Oppenheim and elsewhere. The river that had anchored Germany's western defense was breached. There would be no stabilized front behind it. German units west of the Rhine now faced a choice: fight in place, attempt breakout eastward, or surrender. Many attempted to move eastway from the Americans and toward what they hoped would be safer ground. But roads were clogged. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Columns were bridges were destroyed. Command structures disintegrated. Those who remained west of the Rhine understood the reality. They were trapped at the same time. Hitler's directives grew more detached from conditions on the ground. Orders forbade surrender. Desertion was punishable by death. Field courts-martial operated even as the front collapsed. But enforcement was uneven. Officers increasingly chose discretion over ideology. Some simply stopped transmitting orders as American forces advanced deeper into Western Germany. Entire towns surrendered without resistance. Local commanders opened gates, raised white flags, and handed over weapons. Civil authorities cooperated to prevent destruction. In many cases, surrender was negotiated by officers acting without authorization from higher command. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern. German soldiers learned quickly where American lines were. Some marched for days to reach them. Others waited until nightfall to slip through forests and fields. Groups surrendered en masse. In certain sectors, American units were overwhelmed, not by resistance, but by prisoners. The U.S. Army had not anticipated this scale of capitulation. By late March, reports noted thousands of German soldiers surrendering daily. By April, that number would multiply dramatically. The decision was rarely framed as cowardice. It was framed as survival between the certainty of defeat and the uncertainty of continued fighting. American captivity appeared predictable. The alternative did not. This growing awareness shared across ranks and units set the stage for the largest surrender on the Western Front, and as American armies pushed east, German resistance thinned not because the Wehrmacht lacked men, but because those men had already decided how the decision to surrender is often described as a moment reach its breaking point. In reality, it is a process. For the German soldier, in 1945, that process began with fear not sudden panic, but sustained accumulating dread. Fear of encirclement, fear of annihilation, fear of being ordered to die for ground that no longer mattered, but above all, fear of who would capture them. On the Eastern Front, surrender carried a different meaning. German soldiers who had fought in Russia knew that captivity there was uncertain at best. Millions of Axis prisoners would be taken by the Red Army. Many would never return. Hunger, disease, forced labor, and exposure killed tens of thousands in the first months alone. Survival often depended on chance. This knowledge traveled west with retreating units. Stories passed quietly along the line of comrades disappearing into the east. Of camps without food, of long marches that never ended. Even when exaggerated, the effect was profound. The Soviet Union represented an unknown from which there was no clear return. The Americans were known. Quantities. American units followed procedures. Prisoners were processed efficiently. Food, simple but regular, was issued. Medical personnel treated wounds regardless of uniform. Guards were firm but predictable. There were rules, and those rules were enforced. For exhausted German soldiers, predictability was safety. This contrast shaped behavior long before surrender occurred. Units that might have fought stubbornly against the Soviets withdrew faster in the West. Commanders weighed resistance against the risk of annihilation. Entire battalions delayed movement eastward, waiting for American contact instead. Surrender became a rational act. There was also the human cost of continued fighting. By 1945, many German soldiers were no longer ideologically committed. They were veterans, worn thin by years of war. Others were young conscripts with little training and less belief. Families were scattered. Homes were destroyed. The promise of victory had evaporated, survival not, ideology-guided decisions. American tactics reinforced this logic. Unlike the total destruction often associated with Eastern Front battles, U.S. forces advanced with overwhelming firepower but limited objectives. Towns were bypassed. Resistance was neutralized quickly. Those who surrendered early often avoided heavy bombardment. Altogether, German soldiers noticed this. White flags appeared sooner. Weapons were stacked neatly. Helmets were removed deliberately. These were gestures of intent, not desperation. The act of surrender was structured, controlled, and often premeditated at the same time. German leadership offered no coherent alternative. Hitler's insistence on fighting to the end conflicted directly with the lived reality of his soldiers. Orders arrived late or not at all. Communications failed. Officers on the ground understood that holding out would not change the outcome only, the body count. Some resisted longer out of duty. Others out of fear of retribution, but as American forces closed in, the moral weight shifted. Preserving lives, both their own and civilians, became a higher priority than obedience. In this environment, surrender ceased to feel like collapse. It felt like control. By the spring of 1945. Thousands of German soldiers had already made that calculation. They watched American columns roll past shattered positions. They saw prisoners marched away alive, and they learned something crucial. The war was ending. The question was not if they would surrender. It was where. That realization would soon intersect with the battlefield in a way no commander could stop beyond fear and survival. Surrender in the West was shaped by structure, the absence of it. By early the German command system was breaking apart. The Wehrmacht that had once coordinated lightning campaigns across Europe was now fragmented into isolated commands, each struggling to interpret orders that no longer matched reality. At the top, Hitler remained inflexible. His directives demanded absolute resistance. Cities were declared fortresses. Withdrawals required personal authorization. Surrender was forbidden under any circumstances. These orders were transmitted downward through a chain that no longer functioned. At the front, officers faced conditions their superiors refused to acknowledge. Units were under. Ammunition stocks were minimal. Fuel shortages, immobilized armor, artillery had little effect against overwhelming Allied air power. Communications were disrupted daily by bombing. Commanders often lacked contact with adjacent units, let alone higher headquarters. This created a dangerous vacuum. In that vacuum, initiative shifted from ideology to pragmatism. German officers began to interpret orders selectively. Some delayed engagements. Others withdrew without authorization. A growing number prepared for surrender quietly, waiting for the moment when resistance no longer served any purpose. American operational doctrine accelerated this breakdown. U.S. forces emphasized encirclement over frontal assault. Strong points were bypassed. Supply routes were severed. Pockets were isolated and reduced methodically. German units found themselves surrounded without realizing it, until escape was impossible. Air power sealed their fate by daylight. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. Roads, railways, and bridges were destroyed systematically. Movement during the day became suicidal. German units were confined to forests and villages, cut off from resupply and reinforcement. In these conditions, resistance lost meaning. Leadership mattered, but often in its absence. Many German officers chose not to enforce fight to the last man orders. Some destroyed documents, others removed insignia. A few formally dissolved their units, instructing men to surrender individually rather than face collective punishment. The Wehrmacht was no longer acting as a unified force. It was disintegrating into groups of individuals making personal decisions. American behavior reinforced this trend. Prisoners were not humiliated. Officers were not singled out for abuse. Captured men were processed in large numbers with efficiency. This sent a powerful message back through German lines. Surrender worked as April approached. Entire formations began to give up without major engagements. Some surrendered to the first American patrol they encountered. Others waited for larger units, believing formal surrender would offer better treatment. The contrast with the East was stark. In the East, German units fought until annihilation or escaped westward at all costs. In the West, the logic reversed. Units avoided contact with Soviet forces and actively sought American capture. This strategic migration reshaped the final phase of the war. German resistance in the West thinned because of decisive battles, but because of decisions made quietly, collectively, and often without orders. Each surrender reduced the capacity of the Wehrmacht. The front dissolved March 1945 marked the moment when Germany's western defenses ceased to exist. By the time American forces crossed the Rhine in strength, river had long been more west than a geographic barrier. Already compromised. It was psychological. For decades, what remained was a question of scale. Planning treated how many was the final shield against invasion from the west. The answer would come in a region that once symbolized German industrial power. Fallback plans were built around it. If the Rhine could be held, Germany believed time could still be bought. That belief collapsed on March 7, 1945. Near the town of Ramat, American troops of the U.S. 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge. It was supposed to be destroyed. Charges had been placed. Orders had been issued. But confusion, damaged wiring, and hesitation delayed the demolition. When the Americans arrived, the bridge still stood. Within hours, U.S. infantry were crossing the Rhine on foot. The strategic implications were immediate. A bridgehead was established east of the river. German counterattacks failed. Luftwaffe sorties were ineffective. V-2 rockets and frogmen sent to destroy. The bridge could not reverse what had already happened. The Rhine had been breached intact. Within weeks, additional crossings followed. At Oppenheim, south of Mainz, General George S. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine using pontoon bridges in a carefully planned operation. British and Canadian forces established their own crossings farther north. The river line dissolved under sheer Allied weight. For German forces west of the Rhine, this was decisive. Units that had hoped to retreat across the river found escape routes cut off. Bridges were destroyed prematurely or fell into Allied hands. Communications broke down completely. Entire divisions were now isolated on the western bank. With no realistic path, East American operational tempo increased dramatically. Armored columns surged forward. Infantry followed closely. Resistance was bypassed rather than engaged. Towns were encircled in hours. German units were forced into pockets without realizing it, until they were surrounded on all sides. The psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers watched American tanks advance unopposed along highways once reserved for Wehrmacht parades. Supply depots fell intact. Headquarters were overrun without warning. Officers lost control of their formations in the chaos of rapid movement. By late March, surrender was no longer a question of ideology or loyalty. It was a function of geography. Those west of advancing American spearheads had limited time to decide. Fighting meant annihilation. Waiting meant capture. Escape eastward was increasingly impossible. Many chose surrender immediately. American reports began to note a strange phenomenon. Units advanced cautiously into villages only to be met by dozens, sometimes hundreds, of German soldiers waiting unarmed. White flags were hung from windows. Weapons were stacked in courtyards. Local officials approached with documents and lists. In some sectors, American divisions captured more prisoners than they engaged in combat. This pattern accelerated as April approached. The Western Front was no longer defined by battle lines. It was defined by movement and by collapse. German forces continued to fight in isolated pockets. But the larger structure was gone. Army Group B, tasked with defending the industrial heartland of Germany, was being compressed steadily by American advances from multiple directions. At its center lay the Ruhr Valley, once the engine of German war production. Now a trap dot as American forces closed in from north and south, the last intact German Field Army in the West faced a decision that would define the war's final weeks, and it would not be decided in Berlin, the Ruhr encirclement, and the decision to lay down. Armsby, early April 1945. The Ruhr Valley was no longer a defensive position. It was a sealed pocket. American 1st and 9th Armies advanced with synchronized precision. From the north, U.S. forces pushed south out of the Rhineland. From the south, Patton's 3rd Army drove north after crossing the Rhine. Their objective was not conquest, it was closure. On April 1, 1945, near the town of Lippstadt, American spearheads linked up. Army Group B was encircled. Inside the pocket were approximately 325,000 to 370,000 German soldiers, depending on estimates. They included remnants of the 5th Panzer Army, 15th Army, Volkssturmunix, Luftwaffe, ground personnel, and ad hoc formations pulled together from shattered commands. They were led by Field Marshal Walther Model, one of Hitler's most experienced defensive commanders. But experience could not compensate for reality. The Ruhr pocket contained vast numbers of men but almost no fuel, limited ammunition, minimal food, and virtually no air support. Allied fighter bombers roamed freely overhead. Roads were cratered. Rail lines were destroyed. Command posts were isolated. Orders, when issued, often arrived too late to matter. Model faced an impossible choice. Hitler's instructions were unequivocal. The Ruhr was to be held at all costs. No retreat, no surrender. The industrial region was to be defended until annihilation, if necessary. In Berlin, surrender was still considered treason even now. But Model understood what Berlin no longer could. There was no relief coming, no counteroffensive possible, no strategic value in further resistance. German soldiers inside the pocket knew it as well. Entire units ceased maneuvering and simply waited. Some attempted local breakouts and were destroyed. Others disintegrated into small groups that surrendered independently. Officers found themselves commanding men who no longer believed in orders that led only to death. American tactics inside the Ruhr were deliberate and systematic. They did not rush the pocket. They reduced it town by town, road junction by road junction. Factory complex by factory complex. Resistance was met with overwhelming firepower. But when white flags appeared, American units halted and accepted surrender. Processing centers expanded rapidly. Prisoners were disarmed, counted, documented, and moved west. The scale was unprecedented. On some days, American divisions captured tens of thousands of prisoners without major fighting. Entire battalions marched into captivity intact. German soldiers lined roadsides, waiting calmly for American patrols to arrive. For many, surrender to the Americans was not just préférable, was urgent. Rumors circulated rapidly inside the pocket. Stories of Soviet advances in the east. Accounts of what awaited those captured by Red Army forces. Whether exaggerated or accurate, the fear was real and deeply ingrained. Every hour mattered. On April 15, 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model made his decision. He dissolved Army Group B. Without issuing a formal surrender order, something Hitler had forbidden. Model allowed his commanders to act independently. Units were released from obligation. Officers were told to do what they believed necessary for their men. It was a quiet act of defiance. Model himself refused capture. On April 21, 1945, near Duisburg, he took his own life. His army, however, chose survival by April 18th. Organized resistance in the Ruhr had ceased. Between 317,000 and 325,000 German soldiers surrendered inside the pocket, alone. When combined with capitulations across Western Germany during the same period, the number approached 480,000. German troops who laid down their arms rather than continue fighting or risk capture. Elsewhere, it was not a battlefield collapse marked by chaos and panic, it was a controlled surrender. On a massive scale, for the American forces, it marked the destruction of Germany's last major Western field army. For the German soldiers, it marked the end of a war they could no longer justify. And with the Ruhr gone, there was nothing left to defend between the American armies and the heart of Germany. What followed was not resistance but consequence.